There is something deeply strange about this image. At first glance, it looks like any other photograph from the late 19th century. A European boulevard, rows of ornate stone buildings, gas lamps, a church spire rising in the distance. The cobblestones are clean, the facades are pristine, the sky is flat and pale. Nothing seems unusual until you look closer. The first thing you notice is the silence. There are no people, no pedestrians, no carriages, no horses, no vendors, no children, no smoke from chimneys, no traces of life. A perfectly built city, captured at the height of the industrial age, and yet it feels like a stage after the actors have vanished. The second thing you notice is lower, at street level. Half-buried windows, doors sunk below the pavement line, basement levels that look more like the first floors of buildings that have been swallowed by the ground. It is as if the street has been poured on top of an older city, like a layer of plaster over something that was never meant to be seen again. Historians usually wave this away. Long exposure, they say. Renovation, construction, technical limitations. But when you zoom in, the excuses begin to crack. The shadows fall in ways that do not quite match the angle of the sun. The cobblestones near the curbs slope upwards unnaturally, as though the ground itself has been raised. And those half-buried windows repeat, building after building, block after block, like a pattern pressed into the very architecture. This photograph, supposedly from around 1870, raises a question that official history is strangely reluctant to confront. If this city was alive, where is everyone? And if this is truly a normal 19th century street, why does it look like the surface of something dug out rather than built up? The image becomes even more unsettling when you compare it to others from the same era. Different continents, different climates, different architectural styles, and yet the same emptiness. Grand avenues with no residents, government buildings with no officials, monumental staircases with no footsteps. In some photographs, you can almost feel as though the camera arrived just 1 hour too late, after something had already happened. When we put this in the context of the official timeline, the dissonance grows louder. The late 1800s are presented to us as an era of growth. Expanding populations, booming cities, frenetic construction, industrialization, migration. The story we are told is one of density, movement, overcrowding. And yet, the visual record often whispers something else. Stillness, vacancy, interruption, as if the world paused and then resumed, with certain details carefully edited out. So we are left with a series of uncomfortable questions. If these cities were truly thriving, why were they photographed as if abandoned? If these buildings were really constructed in a few short decades by recently urbanized populations, why do so many of them already appear weathered, dug out, or partially buried? And why do some documents hint at an earlier layer of history, one that does not fit comfortably inside the dates we memorize in school? Some researchers, working outside mainstream academia, have begun to connect this visual silence with something else. A pattern of missing people, missing years, and missing events around the turn of a particular century. They point to scattered references in old chronicles, to strange gaps in local records, to maps that change abruptly after a certain date. They point, again and again, to one number that keeps appearing at the margins of history. 1700. In certain archives, you can still find atlases printed before and after that date. Before, the world looks crowded with unfamiliar names, empires, regions, and cities that no longer exist on any modern map. After, large portions of those names vanish, replaced by blank spaces or simplified borders. The transition is rarely explained. It is treated instead as a natural evolution, a cartographic correction. But the swiftness of the change, the way entire polities seem to dissolve between one edition and the next, raises the same uncomfortable feeling as those empty streets. Something happened here, but we are not told precisely what. There are also testimonies, obscure, fragmentary, often ignored. A travel journal that briefly mentions a great convulsion around the beginning of the 18th century. A regional chronicle that speaks of years when the sky darkened and the seasons failed. A religious tract referring cryptically to the cleansing of the old cities and the raising of new foundations upon the bones of the former age. None of these, taken alone, proves anything. But they form a faint echo, a murmur that seems to align with the visual anomalies in the centuries that followed. Some claim that these traces point toward a global reset, an event or series of events around 1700 that disrupted the world on a scale we struggle to imagine. Others argue for something less dramatic, yet still unsettling. That the early modern period may have been far more unstable, far more catastrophic than our textbooks allow. That entire regions may have been depopulated, rebuilt, and rebranded in ways that later narratives simply smoothed over. But the truth may be stranger than either of these suggestions. If the buried buildings and empty cities are indeed the scars of an earlier catastrophe, then the 19th century, the age we are told is defined by progress, invention, and construction, might instead be the age of excavation, reclamation, and silent reconstruction. A time not of beginnings, but of aftermath. And yet, we must be careful. It is easy to leap from anomaly to conclusion, from a single photograph to a sweeping theory. The approach we will take here is slower, more cautious. We will not declare that there was a single reset in 1700. We will not insist that entire chapters of history were fabricated wholesale. Instead, we will look closely at the evidence that remains, the images, the maps, the written fragments, and ask what they actually show us and what they quietly refuse to explain. Because when we place that quiet 1870 street beside the shifting maps of the early 18th century, when we compare the half-buried windows to the scattered reports of upheaval around that time, a disturbing possibility begins to emerge. That our familiar timeline may be standing on top of an older layer, much like those streets built over forgotten doorways. The events of 1700, whatever they truly were, may have left a deeper imprint than we realize. One that we still walk across every day without seeing. To understand this mystery, we must go back, farther than the photograph, farther than the industrial age, all the way to the threshold of that strange year that sits like a fracture in the chronology. Somewhere around 1700, something happened, and if we listen carefully to the traces it left behind, the picture that forms is far more unsettling than the tidy story we have been given. When we step back from that single photograph and begin to look across a larger archive, an unsettling realization emerges. The anomaly is not isolated. It appears again and again in different countries, under different skies, captured by different cameras, drawn by different hands. What felt like a strange exception slowly becomes a repeating motif. Silent streets, immaculate facades, buried doorways, and a sense of absence so pervasive it feels intentional. There are entire collections from the mid to late 19th century in which not a single living person appears. Cities that were supposedly bustling, Berlin, Boston, Moscow, Paris, St. Louis, are depicted as though they were paused in mid-breath. Sometimes the emptiness looks staged, almost ceremonial. Other times, it feels like the residue of something that had just happened, a stillness left behind after a storm. And yet, these photographs continue to be labeled as normal. They were catalogued, archived, published, and quietly accepted as part of the visual history of an era we are told was overcrowded, chaotic, and rapidly expanding. The contradiction is rarely addressed. It simply sits there, locked inside the images themselves, waiting for someone to notice. But the emptiness is not the only anomaly that repeats. As you move from photographs to buildings themselves, another pattern emerges, one hidden not in absence, but in scale. Doorways stretching 5 to 7 meters high, windows larger than modern billboards, archways that feel proportioned for beings twice our size, staircases so wide and so steep that they resemble terraces rather than steps, ceilings rising 30 meters overhead, echoing like cavernous vaults. These elements appear not in a handful of structures, but in thousands across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia and Australia. The official explanation is always the same: decorative grandeur. But the consistency of the proportions across different cultures, different architects, different materials suggests something more deliberate. It hints at another kind of population, one that may have lived before the reconstruction phases of the 18th and 19th centuries. Or perhaps at least a very different purpose behind these structures than the uses we assign them today. To understand the weight of these anomalies, we have to step into the historical landscape of the time. The mid-1800s are often described as an age of transformation. Steam engines, telegraphs, railroads, rapid urbanization. Entire nations redrawing their boundaries, cities expanding outward, populations increasing at unprecedented rates. This is the narrative presented in textbooks, a world racing forward. But beneath this surface, there is another history, one that does not align so neatly. Old atlases printed before the 1800s show a world that feels both familiar and foreign. Regions marked with names we no longer recognize. Empires whose borders stretch in ways that defy modern political geography. And then, in the decades following 1700, the maps begin to change. Quietly at first, then rapidly. Territories vanish, names dissolve. A particular empire, one once spanning a vast portion of Eurasia, appears consistently in earlier maps and then disappears entirely from later ones, as if erased in a single editorial sweep. Historians explain this as cartographic correction, an evolution of accuracy. But the abruptness is difficult to ignore. It mirrors the abruptness in those silent photographs, in the buried buildings, in the sudden architectural shift. The pattern begins to whisper of something more than mere cartographic refinement, something like a rupture. Old engravings provide further fragments. Woodcuts from the 1600s and early 1700s depict machines and structures that seem too advanced for their supposed time. Massive energy towers, intricate star-shaped fortresses, monumental citadels carved with precision that modern tools struggle to reproduce. In travel journals, explorers occasionally mention strange ruins, abandoned cities, or landscapes that appeared scarred by some upheaval. These references are rare, scattered, often no more than a sentence or two. But together, they form the faint edges of a picture that refuses to disappear. And then there is the buried architecture. Across continents, buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries often sit partially submerged, as if the ground rose around them. Basement levels with ornate windows, door frames that stand below the current street line, entire lower floors sealed behind layers of earth. This phenomenon is visible in St. Petersburg, in Prague, in Denver, in Rome, in Melbourne. The official explanation varies from city to city: floods, reconstruction, street leveling. But the uniformity of the pattern suggests something more global. If these anomalies appeared only in isolated pockets, we might dismiss them as quirks of local history. But they appear everywhere, They appear consistently, and they all point toward a disruption that affected vast regions of the world in a similar way. At this point, a larger question forms quietly in the background. Why do so many artifacts from before 1800 feel older than they should? And why do so many structures after 1800 feel inherited rather than newly constructed? Some researchers have suggested that events around the early 1700s, events largely absent from mainstream narratives, may hold the key. References to a great calamity, to seasons that failed, to skies that darkened, to migrations that left cities empty, appear sporadically in regional documents. These accounts are seldom included in modern histories, which tend to treat the early 18th century as largely stable. But the fragments remain, difficult to reconcile with that stability. Others point to the depopulation anomalies. In some regions, census records appear to reset abruptly, only to show dramatic increases a few decades later. Rates of growth that exceed biological plausibility. In architecture, timelines from construction archives do not always match the condition of the buildings themselves. Structures supposedly built in the 1850s already appear aged and weathered in photographs taken only 10 or 15 years later. None of these observations provide definitive answers, but they raise questions. Large, uncomfortable ones. Why are so many cities photographed empty? Why do so many buildings appear buried? Why do pre-1700 maps show empires that disappear without explanation? Why do engravings depict technologies that seem anachronistic? Why do population records fluctuate in ways that make little sense? A reasonable person might ask whether these irregularities could be evidence of a larger event, one that took place not in the 19th century, but in the years surrounding 1700. A disruption significant enough to alter populations, erase polities, bury cities, and reshape landscapes. Something that left behind traces too large to fully conceal, yet too scattered to easily interpret. Some historians have quietly acknowledged that the early modern period contains unusual discontinuities. Others remain silent. Perhaps the evidence is inconclusive. Perhaps it is simply inconvenient. But the more we look at these anomalies, side by side, across continents, the more they resemble not random curiosities, but the signatures of something immense. If they were isolated, we could ignore them, but they are everywhere. And to understand the scale of what they suggest, we must now turn to the evidence that survived. Evidence that begins to collapse the timeline itself. When we begin placing these anomalies side by side, empty streets, buried buildings, vanished empires, inconsistent maps, impossible architecture, something unexpected happens. The fragments begin to align. The silence in the photographs starts to echo the silence in the records. The buried windows begin to resemble the buried chronologies. And the world that should feel stable, familiar, and chronologically secure begins to soften at the edges. A pattern starts to form, faint at first, then sharper. Something shifted around the year 1700. Not gradually, not organically, but abruptly, as though a page had been turned, not by time, but by force. Look again at the empty cities of the 19th century. They are often portrayed as construction sites, works in progress, newborn cities still waiting for their inhabitants. But many of these photographs show cities that were already complete. Streets paved, facades finished, monuments polished, trees planted. They do not look unfinished. They look recently uncovered, as though something older had been excavated, cleaned, and repurposed. And when you place this beside the proliferation of oversized architecture, colossal doors, towering arches, cavernous halls, you begin to question whether these structures were truly designed for the people who later occupied them. They feel inherited, not created. Found, not engineered. A legacy from an earlier period, one that left behind its monuments, but not its builders. And then there are the maps. in dozens of atlases printed before the 18th century. Large portions of Eurasia are marked with the presence of a vast polity, sometimes an empire, sometimes a cultural sphere, whose name quietly disappears in later editions. The territories are not conquered, divided, or renamed according to known historical events. They simply vanish, replaced by ambiguous borders and blank spaces, as if a cartographer had erased a layer of reality and drawn a new one on top. So the questions begin to sharpen. If the cities were thriving, why did the cameras find them empty? If the buildings were new, why were they already buried? If the maps were accurate, why were their contents erased? If the technology of the time was limited, why do earlier engravings show machines that challenge our understanding of the era? Historians provide explanations. Technical issues with early photography, reconstruction projects, cartographic simplification, artistic exaggeration. But the explanations do not fit together. They address each anomaly in isolation, never as a pattern. And when the anomalies are viewed collectively, the contradictions grow too large to ignore. A more unsettling possibility emerges. These fragments represent the aftermath of an event, one that left the world disoriented, depopulated, or disrupted enough that reconstruction became necessary on a global scale. Some researchers outside mainstream academia suggest that the 19th century, rather than being an age of creation, may have been an age of restoration, an attempt to rebuild or repurpose structures inherited from an earlier civilization. They point to records of new cities appearing too quickly, in too many places, with too few documented laborers to explain their construction. They highlight census anomalies, regions that seem to lose much of their population in the early 18th century, only to experience implausibly rapid growth later. Then there are the climate records. In the years surrounding 1700, several regions report unusual weather. Extreme cold, crop failures, seasons that did not behave as expected. These accounts are often dismissed as local anomalies, but when read collectively, they paint a picture of global instability, a possible environmental or atmospheric disturbance that may have reshaped entire regions. Alternative explanations begin to form. Perhaps there was a catastrophe, natural or otherwise, that disrupted populations, buried cities, and erased polities from the map. Perhaps the 19th century's construction boom was simply the resurfacing of structures already present beneath layers of earth. Perhaps the empty photographs captured not an everyday city, but a world still recovering from an event no longer spoken of. But these possibilities remain possibilities. We do not claim certainty here. Instead, we ask questions that mainstream narratives seem strangely unwilling to examine. Why do engravings from the 1600s and early 1700s show fortresses shaped like stars, symmetrical to a degree that suggests advanced surveying technology? Why do travelers' journals reference cities abandoned after the Great Shaking, or landscapes that bore the scars of upheaval? Why do so many 19th century buildings lack detailed construction records, as though they appeared suddenly rather than being slowly built? Why do population graphs show erratic dips around the early 1700s, only to rise with impossible acceleration afterward? One historian, writing cautiously in the margins of a nearly forgotten monograph, noted, between 1645 and 1715, many regions underwent changes the records cannot fully account for. No explanation follows. Only the observation, only the silence. As the anomalies connect, the timeline begins to wobble. The history we are taught begins to feel like the upper layer of a multi-strata story, with older layers hidden or buried beneath. The architecture hints at a scale of engineering that does not match the documented capabilities of the period. The maps hint at political landscapes that no longer exist. The photographs hint at cities that may have been reclaimed, not built. And the climate records hint at something that affected the entire globe, not isolated pockets of it. A core hypothesis, still unproven but increasingly difficult to dismiss, quietly takes shape. The world we live in may be the continuation of a civilization older than we realize. Disrupted around the early 1700s, partially buried, partially erased, and then inherited by those who came after. If this is true, even partially true, then the 19th century was not the beginning of our modern world, but the reconstruction of one that had already existed. And those empty streets, those buried windows, those vanished empires, were not anomalies at all, but the natural traces of a reset. But the most unsettling evidence has not yet been addressed, because one artifact, one piece of the puzzle, has the potential to collapse the entire narrative. To understand the full scale of what may have been erased, we must examine it next. But one piece of evidence changes everything. It sits quietly in the back of an archive, rarely studied, rarely cited, often dismissed as a cartographic curiosity. At first glance, it looks like any other early 18th century map. Aged paper, faded ink, ornate compass roses. But the moment you compare it to the maps that came just decades later, something impossible emerges. This particular map, dated near the cusp of the year 1700, shows a world that feels familiar and unfamiliar at once. Coastlines recognizable, mountain ranges recognizable. But across Eurasia, a vast territory stretches over land that modern maps divide into many nations. It is labeled with a name that appears in dozens of pre-1700 atlases and vanishes almost overnight after 1750. The borders do not shrink. They do not fragment. They do not get renamed following known wars. They simply disappear, replaced by territories drawn in vague, tentative shapes, as though the cartographers who followed did not know, or were not permitted to show, what came before. Place this map beside one from the 1760s. The difference is staggering. Entire cities gone, rivers redrawn, regions stripped of labels or given new identities without recorded transitions. It is as though the world experienced a memory wipe. The unsettling part is not that the earlier map shows something different. It is that the later maps all show the same rewritten version, with astonishing consistency, as though they were copying from a new template. One constructed after an event powerful enough to necessitate the rewriting of geography itself. This is where shock logic begins to form. The system does not contradict itself softly. It contradicts itself boldly, cleanly, abruptly. And that abruptness mirrors the silence we saw in those 19th century photographs. The sense that something foundational had already been lost. Now look at the architectural record. In the decades after this mysterious cartographic disappearance, we suddenly see a proliferation of monumental buildings. Endless rows of cathedrals, palaces, courthouses, grand halls, opera houses, all sharing the same colossal proportions we noted earlier. But here's the contradiction. The same buildings that supposedly were built in the mid-1800s appear in sketches and engravings dated earlier. A structure labeled "completed in 1862" appears fully intact in a drawing from 1845. A cathedral listed as built in 1870 is visible, finished with weathered stone, in a map from 1830, and in the strangest cases, construction photographs, meant to document the building process, show scaffolding placed around already existing facades, as though the builders were modifying rather than constructing. In some images, large stone blocks show erosion inconsistent with being newly quarried. In others, the lower floors are already buried while the upper floors are being added. The pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The timeline of construction does not align with the physical evidence of the structures. And then, across continents, a single anomaly rises above all others. The buried floors, You can find them in San Francisco, in Venice, in Istanbul, in Warsaw, in Buenos Aires, in Edinburgh, in Melbourne. In some cities, entire districts sit 1 or 2 stories below the current street level. Doors that should open onto the street now open onto soil. Windows meant for daylight now stare into darkness. In Denver, the old street level survives beneath the modern one. In certain European capitals, guides speak quietly of hidden floors sealed long ago. The explanations, floods, urban leveling, reconstruction, fail to account for the consistency of the phenomenon across climates, continents, and cultures. How does the same architectural burial occur in so many places, at roughly the same time, under completely different governments? This is the signature anomaly of the niche, the one that forces even skeptical viewers to pause, because it implies one of 2 things. Either the ground rose uniformly across the world, or large portions of cities were already buried when the modern populations arrived. And that brings us back to the year 1700. Climate reconstructions show a cluster of extreme events around that time. Sudden cold, unusual storms, volcanic aerosols, crop failures. Certain texts describe a darkened sky lasting months. Others speak of the cleansing of old cities and the rebuilding of foundations. Some regional chronicles quietly mention earthquakes of extraordinary scale, earthquakes not recorded in modern global catalogs. Then there are the fires. Between 1840 and 1880, dozens of major cities across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia suffered catastrophic fires. Chicago, Boston, Toronto, St. Louis, Moscow, Istanbul, Yokohama. The fires appear disproportionate and oddly synchronized, as if many cities were being wiped at the same time during an era of supposedly primitive infrastructure. Were these simply coincidences? Were they the result of wooden construction, careless lamps, and growing urban density? That is the official explanation. But the frequency, scale, and timing suggest something more systematic. Either a world still unstable from an earlier catastrophe, or a coordinated effort to erase older architectural layers. And if the buildings were not newly built, but inherited, then what exactly was being burned? The consequences of such an event, if it occurred, would be profound. A sudden reduction in population, cities partially buried, political structures collapsing or being overwritten, maps redrawn to reflect a new reality. Survivors rebuilding atop ruins they did not fully understand. Technologies forgotten, then rediscovered, or misunderstood entirely. This would explain the abrupt appearance of advanced engineering in earlier engravings. This would explain the empty cities, captured before repopulation. This would explain the massive architectural scale, designed perhaps for a previous population. This would explain the sudden disappearance of entire civilizations from the maps. And it leads to the question that mainstream history carefully avoids. Who or what was responsible for the shift? We are not claiming answers. We cannot. But the possibilities linger uneasily. Was there a global environmental catastrophe around 1700? Was an earlier civilization erased or fragmented? Were cities excavated rather than constructed? Was humanity reset, not metaphorically but literally? We cannot resolve these questions here. But the cross-continental consistency, the architectural inheritance, the rewritten maps, all point toward an event that was not local, not regional, but planetary. And yet, even now, one final piece remains. One last anomaly, quiet, unassuming, and more disturbing than all the rest. Because while we can infer the traces of a catastrophe, we still have not confronted what came after it. To understand that, we must move to the final chapter. When we step back from the evidence, scattered photographs, shifting maps, buried foundations, oversized architecture, unexplained fires, something subtle but unmistakable emerges. Not a neatly packaged conclusion, not a definitive answer, but a shape, a vague silhouette forming behind the fog of centuries. This shape does not insist on itself. It whispers. It lingers. It suggests that the world we inhabit may be built upon layers of stories, each one partially erased to make room for the next. The anomalies alone do not speak, but together they hum with a quiet resonance. The empty cities suggest interruption. The buried buildings suggest displacement. The vanished empires suggest redaction. The sudden reconstruction suggests aftermath. None of this is definitive. And yet, the pattern feels too deliberate, too consistent, to dismiss as coincidence. When all of these fragments are placed in sequence, the 19th century begins to look less like a moment of unprecedented creation and more like the careful reconstruction of something far older. The scale of the architecture, the silence of the photographs, the absence of construction records. Each detail seems to tug at the edges of the official narrative, pulling it gently apart. And that brings us to a quiet realization. If the world experienced a rupture around the year 1700, its consequences would not only be physical, they would be historical, cultural, civilizational. The catastrophe, whatever form it took, may have reshaped the world not only through destruction, but through memory. The survivors may have rebuilt cities, but they may also have rewritten their past. Not maliciously, not conspiratorially, simply as a way of understanding a world changed beyond recognition. Perhaps that is why so much of the era feels like it begins in the middle of a sentence. Perhaps that is why certain technologies appear before they should. Perhaps that is why entire populations vanish from records, only to reappear decades later in numbers difficult to explain. Perhaps that is why the architecture feels inherited. Perhaps that is why some maps read like palimpsests, traces of older worlds lurking beneath newer lines. None of this proves anything. But the absence of proof is not the same as the absence of truth. History is fragile. It depends on those who write it and on what they choose to preserve. Events can be forgotten. Civilizations can vanish. Even memories can be reshaped, intentionally or not, by those tasked with recording them. And so we arrive at a moment of quiet reflection. What if what we call history is only the version that survived? What if our world is younger, older, or simply more complicated than we imagine? What if the past is not a straight line, but a series of resets, interruptions, and reconstructions? What if the catastrophe of 1700 was not the end of an era, but the erasure of one, and the beginning of ours? These are not claims, they are questions. Questions raised not by speculation, but by the silent evidence we can still touch. Stone, brick, paper, maps, and images. Questions that deserve contemplation, even if they lead us nowhere certain. And so the inquiry shifts from history to philosophy. Who shapes the stories we inherit? Why do some chapters survive while others fade? How many layers lie beneath the cities we walk through every day? How much of our world is built on ruins we no longer recognize? How many events, quiet or catastrophic, have slipped through the cracks of our collective memory? History is not fixed. It is a puzzle assembled by hands we never meet, guided by priorities we rarely understand. Every buried window, every sealed doorway, every missing empire is a reminder that our understanding is incomplete. The world holds secrets because the world forgets. And sometimes, the forgetting is the most revealing part of all. Standing in front of those old maps, tracing borders that no longer exist, you may feel a strange unease, a sense that the past is not behind us, but beneath us. Layers upon layers. Some documented, some erased, some merely hinted at. Perhaps the catastrophe around 1700 was one such layer. Too disruptive to integrate neatly, too vast to ignore, and therefore quietly set aside. And yet, traces remain. In stone, in soil, in archives. In the silence of streets that should have been crowded. In buildings that seemed designed for another kind of humanity. In the faint memory of a world that once was. and perhaps still is, buried under ours. We may never know with certainty what happened. Was there a reset? Was a civilization erased? Did a global event reshape the world's foundations? Was our history rewritten, not maliciously, but out of necessity? The questions remain open, suspended between what we can see and what we can only sense. But the investigation does not end here. Because as strange as these anomalies are, they are not the last. There is another event, rarely discussed, quietly referenced, and far more enigmatic, that appears in the margins of certain records. An event that predates even the catastrophe of 1700. An event whose traces are almost invisible, except to those who know where to look. And in that next chapter, the puzzle deepens. Until then, one truth remains. The past is not what we think, and maybe it never was.